So thank you, Minister Aziz, for such a detailed and full of energy speech. I think this is quite rare among a minister for a major country. So now let me invite Dr. Andrew Sheng, former chairman of Hong Kong SFC, and now distinguished fellow at Asia Global Institute of University of Hong Kong.
Thank you, Li Wei.
So Julia Liang, who is also on stage this morning, right now the CEO of Hong Kong FSC, like to call you her teacher forever. So I'd like to tap your wisdom today on what's your thinking after hearing Minister's speech for our Chinese companies and Hong Kong companies willing to go to Malaysia. And specifically, I have a question in mind, which is Indonesia during last year has attracted a lot of attention with G20 presidency. How do you think are the balance of opportunity in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, these bigger economies in Southeast Asia?
Thank you. I'm sorry you have to hear me twice today, but Tunku Zafrul and I were from the same university, University of Bristol in England. And he's an example of the dynamic, young, up-and-coming technocrats that are coming in Malaysia. He was former Minister of Finance. Then before that, he ran actually the most largest ASEAN footprint CIMB bank, and now he's Minister of Trade and Industry. His main message today was that Malaysia can be the gateway to ASEAN and Hong Kong can be the gateway to China. And I think this is a very, very good message. But I think most, for the last 20 years, Hong Kong and to a large extent China has been very, I wouldn't like to use the word obsessed, but it was dominated by the rapid growth of China. But what tended to underestimate that ASEAN is 700 million people, half the size of China in population and India, and in geographical space, half the size of China, and 1/3 larger than India. And then, Tunku Zafrul raised a very fundamental point, which was that China plus ASEAN is 2 billion. Plus India is 3.4 billion, which is 43% of world population. Now, why is that very important? Because the average age of ASEAN 700 million is only 28 years old. In China, it's 38 years old. Okay, and China is aging faster. But ASEAN is only 28 years old, and one of the most technically STEM education based, around the world. Now, why is ASEAN growing so fast? And the answer is, it's got huge natural resources. It's got oil and gas. It de facto controls the Malacca Straits, which is the most important, most busy part of the trade around the world. It's got huge natural resources in terms of minerals, in terms of forestry, and in terms of marine waters. So the potential of ASEAN really needs to be refocused on. Now, Indonesia is growing at 5%. Vietnam, 100 million, is growing at nearly 6%, okay, and probably going towards 7%. And Philippines will be growing at 6%, which means that by the 2030, ASEAN will together be larger than the Japanese economy or the German economies singly, as a group. So the potential is huge. Now, what you say, well, Indonesia is very, very good. And I think, Indonesia has become aware that, it will become the 5th largest economy by the 2040s to the 2050s. Because population, Indonesia is 288 million population, which is huge, right? Now, for me, who has worked quite a lot within ASEAN, I discovered that the spirit of innovation growth in Indonesia reminds me very much of the period of growth in Malaysia in the 90s when Malaysia was growing at 10%, 8 to 10% per year. So in my view, towards as we get closer to 2030, 2035, you will find ASEAN, Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia, barring no complications from geopolitical tensions, growing in the region of 8 to 10%. That's my own personal prediction. So the potential for ASEAN to work with China and India and as a whole group is huge. People tend to forget this. China accounted for, China plus ASEAN really accounted for 70% of the growth, last year worldwide. So plus India, of course, right? Which means that there is a huge potential now for Chinese companies to come. And when you come to ASEAN, you will find there are a lot of people who speak Chinese, there are a lot of people who speak English, there are a lot of people who speak Indian, and they also speak Malay. So the opportunities are there, but how you engage it now is going to be a complicated market.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean Western companies, including companies here in Hong Kong and China, should all go to Southeast Asia instead of going to China? Or say there are a lot of pressure, Chinese companies relocating to Southeast Asia?
Well, as you know, because of the geopolitical tensions, the supply chains are decoupling. So just to give you an illustration, last year, Intel invested $7 billion in Penang, right? And why is it Penang? That's where I live, right, in Malaysia. And why is it investing $7 billion in Penang? Because Intel started in Penang in 1971, 10 years earlier than the Hsinchu industrial zone in Taiwan. All right? And Penang is the 6th largest semiconductor, base in the world, accounting for roughly just under 8% of chip production. Now, not the latest, highest technology, but a lot of the testing and the assembly is also done in Penang. So just to give you an illustration, going to ASEAN is not just for the mineral resources. The industrial base is actually quite strong, and particularly in Thailand, which is one of the world's largest automotive component manufacturing base in the world, right? And then, of course, there's some of the other areas.
Yeah, over the past years, Chinese companies and entrepreneurs has been fascinated by Singapore. So from what you just said, should Chinese companies look more to countries like Malaysia as a gateway or springboard for Southeast Asia?
No, I think Singapore, whenever people say, when I was in Hong Kong, people say, well, will Singapore take over from Hong Kong? I don't believe that. East Asia and South Asia are now, as I said, 40% of the population of the world and fastest growth. There is more than enough room of financial centers, right? So you cannot, put aside. The fundamental thing you must understand about East Asia, that East Asia, including Southeast Asia, is a net lender to the world. There's no shortage of savings. The only question is, how do you deploy it to stimulate the growth, including that of South Asia? Because once South Asia and Southeast Asia begin to grow, India is already growing at 6%, and if you add Southeast Asia growing at 6+%, the demand of savings for long-term investments, especially green infrastructure, will be huge.
Perhaps last question. So would that be not a win-win between China and Southeast Asia? Last evening, as well as I think today at the sideline of the conference, I think not many people are very optimistic about the recent situation within China, in mainland China, economically and from unemployment, things like that. Can companies kind of more look to Southeast Asia at the expense of the Chinese economy? Would that be a
No,
risk?
I don't believe in this. I think I want to welcome Pascal Lamy, who is the leader on trade, right? Trade is always win-win unless you try to stop it, right? I mean, the issue is that actually ASEAN is highly complementary to China, just as ASEAN is highly complementary to India. Throughout history, before Europe came up, I mean, the trade was really between, these three areas, and of course the Middle East, right? So in my view, there is not a, win-lose situation in this area. China is a base now of the Asian global supply chain, right? So it will need the natural resources. ASEAN provides it, and can also provide the labor force, because it's very, very young, and the future market.
So this should dispel some of the unwarranted fears within China of kind of industry moving to Southeast Asia. So thank you very much, unless you have a last-minute thought.
No, I think everybody will want to listen to Pascal. So
Yeah.
thank you for giving
very
me the
much.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.